Welcome everybody to our second Lunch and Learn of the spring 2022 year. And we have with us today Isabella Segalovich. Is that how you say it?
Yeah, Segalovich.
Segalovich. And I wanted to read off to you guys her bio, which is that she is an artist, designer, writer, and TikToker who researches the intersections of politics and design. She graduated from Haverford College with a degree in fine arts and visual studies and learned about the intersections of race and design while working at Colloquate Design in New Orleans, a social and racial justice-based architecture and design firm. In the past year, she has built a TikTok platform of over 150,000 followers, discussing how forces like white supremacy, oh my God, I can't, my screen is blocked by my own technology here. For design and architecture, she also writes and posts videos for, what's the name of the journal?
Hyperallergic.
Okay, sorry about that.
No.
So without further ado, I'm going to give the board over to Isabella and take it away.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right, I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. And then go full screen. This is first time we've done this. Okay, perfect. All right, so it might take a second to load, but thank you so much. I am so excited to be here. We're gonna jump right in because there's a lot to go. It's a lot to go through. You're gonna see we are gonna go through a whole bunch of history from a couple different eras, and it'll all be surrounding this question of ornament. And combating racism and white supremacy in design. So yeah, we're just gonna jump right in. So this is what I want everyone to take a look at for a moment first, because this really is kind of the basis from where I'm coming from. This is a ceiling at the Blue Mosque in Tabriz, Iran. This is very old, of course. There's two parts of this that I want you to kind of look at and keep at the back of your mind, kind of as we go through the presentation. And the first thing is obviously this glorious, beautiful design tiles. These are handcrafted. And the second thing is the way that the ornament here interacts with the space and the way that it's so very carefully crafted to do that. And so we're going to look at a word that I am positive that we know, but we're going to just kind of dissect it a little bit, which is ornament. And this is really everything that I study, everything that I do kind of comes back to this. Is generally defined as something that is put on top. It's something supplementary to make something look more attractive. It usually has no practical purpose, especially so this could be anything from surface design to a small figurine. And so hopefully throughout the presentation, we might be able to push back on that definition a little bit. So the history of ornament is infinitely big. I try to say infinitely big because when conceiving of what ornament looks like throughout history, there's no one person can conceive of just how expansive this history is. As essentially every folk culture, every indigenous culture from all time has an ornamental tradition. So this is all the way from West Africa, from Adinkra symbols, we're going to talk about in a second, to this is in the middle is batik fabric, which is from Southeast Asia. And then on the right, we have Wayu indigenous weaving that is from Colombia. So all of these are handcrafted traditions that have very specific symbols that are literally woven into or carved into the heritage. So we're going to focus on a couple of these now. The first one we're going to focus on for a second is Adinkra symbols. These are from Ghana. We often imagine folk culture or any type of culture that comes out of that that kind of craft as something that's really old, but actually Adinkra symbols are fairly newer. They're from around the 1800s, and they are endowed with very, very, very complex meanings and very deep meanings, often in the form of poems or aphorisms that are longer than even just a couple phrases often. And so some of the presentation, I'm going to be kind of making references to things to kind of pique your interest. And I've made videos on a lot of these things, but there's also just a wealth of information out there. But this is a very complicated and fascinating story of the ways that enslaved and recently free iron workers in New Orleans they would not only craft all of the ironwork that's around that beautiful city, but also weave the actual Adinkra symbols. They designed they designed those wrought iron as well. And so all of those symbols carry those extremely complex and meaningful poems with them. So this one is Duanoem, that means it is with the heart and not with the horns, that leaves the ram to bully. So they were often concealed meanings, and those are things that are left with the soul of that city. There's also, by the way, a very interesting history with rebellion, and that comes from Haiti as well. So this is also a story of resistance. But again, just making a reference to that, it's a very, very fascinating tale. So these are pisanki, these are Ukrainian Easter eggs. And of course, this is something to keep in the back of our mind as well. This is something that we see a lot of destruction of Ukraine's heritage is happening at this very moment. But this is actually something I would have actually brought in either way, because this is a very, very important and really good example of the way that ornament carries meaning. So each of the symbols on these eggs are not only very beautiful, but they actually carry very ancient meanings with them as well. And so these actually go back, these go back a very long way to, pre-Christian era. And there are many people in Ukraine who continue these pre-Christian traditions as well. So you have right here, so more recently, the cross would be something that symbolizes Christ. But we also have the star, which is for good life and good fortune, the sun, which is a symbol of life, the spiral, which is divinity or immortality. We have a lot of things, a lot of symbols that will also represent fertility. And one thing that is really fascinating, I think, about a lot of these ornamental traditions is that they often endow objects with life themselves. So there's a lot of animist belief systems that go along with this. And so, for example, if you were in Ukraine, even not so long ago, you might plant one of these eggs along with your harvest. So that would encourage fertility and growth with the harvest. So that is of the ornament there. So we're actually going to start swiveling over to Western Europe, where we're going to spend a lot of time. So in the 1800s, we kind of, I think it's interesting, we kind of view, let me know if I'm breaking up, by the way, it says my connection is unstable, but we kind of view, England, we don't generally associate it with being this very colorful place, of course. But if we actually look into the Victorian era, you can see that artists and architects were totally obsessed with color and ornament. And so you would see people like Owen Jones, who attempted to catalog the world's ornament for the coming Industrial Revolution. So the idea was that he would have this compendium of absolutely, really beautiful illustrations, and the idea is that they could be reproduced along with new materials that they were producing. And of course, there's a lot of history of colonialism and Orientalism here as well, and we're going to make reference back to that in a little bit. But we also had people like William Morris, who was actually an anti-colonialist. He was anti-imperialist, not an angel, by the way. He had a very complicated backstory with arsenic mines, but he eventually did become a socialist an incredibly far left socialist, and saw art and social change as something that was intertwined. And so one of the things that he was doing was trying to attempt to revitalize the craft traditions in England. And so he also developed this incredibly luscious, very decadent wallpaper type of tradition. And so we're going to see a little bit what that looks like as well. So the taste of that time in the Victorian era was really maximalist. It was really over the top. There was tons of patterns and colors. And again, there's kind of a complicated history there with that kind of this kind of intertwines with Orientalism as well, which again we'll make reference to very soon. But this is really just to emphasize how dense and colorful Western European interior design trends were at the time. And this is actually a revived version of that tradition in a newer Victorian style. But this is something that I wanted to kind of put that out there because what happened? What happened to like Western European professional high class quote unquote high class sensibilities? Why did it change to be something that was instead extremely bleak, minimal, and sleek? And so we're going to talk about Adolf Loos. So who was Adolf Loos? He is someone that's at the center of a lot of what I researched. He was an architect. He was Austrian in Vienna in the early 1900s. He wrote this lecture, Ornament and Crime, in 1908, and he delivered it in 1910 as a lecture. So we're going to take a look at what he said. Why did he think that ornament and color was considered a crime? So this paragraph, I'm just going to read it off. It's incredibly horrible. And this is at the very beginning of his essay, by the way. So this is very close to the beginning. The child is immoral, so too is the Papuan to us. And he's referencing indigenous people from Papua New Guinea. The Papuan kills his enemies and eats them. He is no criminal, but if a modern kills someone and eats him, he is a criminal or a degenerate. The Papuan tattoos his skin, his boats, his udder, his oars, in short, everything he can get his hands on. He is no criminal. The modern man who tattoos himself is a criminal or degenerate. There are prisons in which 80% of the prisoners are tattooed. Tattooed men who are not behind bars are either latent criminals or degenerate aristocrats. If someone who is tattooed dies in freedom, then he does so a few years before he would have committed a murder. So this is an incredibly racist speech that is still incredibly influential in architecture today. It is still taught or still assigned in many, many, many architecture programs. It is seen as kind of a fundamental text of modernism. And far too often, it is looked at without any type of critical lens. And so we're going to take a look at a couple of the people that he points out. So only of course, and we're gonna dissect that in a second. He's also calling out this kind of Victorian maximal super ornamental aesthetic. We saw that there were a lot of wealthier Victorians were wearing tattoos themselves. They were obsessed with tattoos. And so he was so one of the things is that he's actually calling for kind of like an erasure of decadence, which he sees as kind of the same thing as wealth. But he also calls us out in people that are of a much lower socioeconomic class. So he's looking at Slovak traditional clothing. That's something that he brings up a little bit later on, that Slovaks are also doing the same thing that's making them more quote unquote primitive. But I really want to focus on what he focuses on the most, which is the traditional Papuan tattooing. Papuan tattooing of Papua New Guinea is, of course, a really old practice, a really, really sacred practice. And this is a type of indigenous tattooing that actually a lot of people are beginning to reclaim, are beginning to take back. And all of these ornaments are not only beautiful, but contain very deep meanings or societal meanings. So it can say who your family is, if you're successful in your tribe. So a lot of different meanings that have their societal structures woven into them. And these are a couple of books that look at these kind of these ancient indigenous tattooing practices. So there's something very specific that he says, that the human embryo goes through all phases of animal life while still in the womb. His childhood runs through all the changes corresponding to the history of mankind. At the age of 2, he looks like a Papuan. At 4, like the ancient Germanic tribe. At 6, like Socrates, and at 8, like Voltaire. So what does he mean by that? So he is from a society, a group called the Fabians. And the Fabians were really, really into scientific racism and social Darwinism. So they were taking this idea of evolution from Darwin in the late 1800s and applying it in a way to say that the white race and Western Europeans specifically are more advanced and literally more evolved than everyone else in the world. And so you have these incredibly racist depictions, like here from Nott and Glidden, where they view, for example, people from Africa as literally like closer to monkeys. So this is something that is showing that I'm going to put this next part up, that they're setting up this binary that as you grow older, you become also more of an adult, you become sophisticated, more civilized. And these civilizations are, again, they believe literally more evolved and thus more fully human than in the indigenous people that they were conquering. And so this also becomes really interesting when criminality is applied to it as well, where you can see that he criminalizes tattoos, where as soon as you're not an upstanding society member anymore, that is a symbol of, joining the kind of this other part, like this uncivilized, part of the binary that he sets up. So the other question is, why does he focus so much on Papuan tattooing? So again, this is at the time, especially like in Vienna, people from Papua New Guinea were put up as that kind of primitive society. So they're commonly described in academic settings as with negative characteristics, as primitive, as being literally more childish. And so you can also see this in the person we talked about a little before, from Owen Jones, this illustration of a Maori face, also from kind of the Polynesian area, where it's in addition to the facial markings, he also put this very strange expression on the face, the kind of stretched out mouth and very intense kind of closed eyes, facial expression. This is all in kind of emphasize the fact that this person is quote unquote not civilized. Okay, keep going. So this is not only in ornament and tattooing, but this also, this kind of idea goes over into architecture at large. And this is actually going back a little bit before Adolf Loos was drawing on a long history of racism that is ingrained into architecture. But this really started again happening around that time of social Darwinism, where it was really codified by people like Eugène Viollet-le-Duc. And so we know him for redesigning Notre Dame, but he also was a person that codified race into architecture. And so he would literally he had wrote this book where he had literal racist depictions. So like he kind of racial characteristics that they would put onto people and then describe their styles of architecture. So the idea was that you were a certain race, you were intrinsically given to creating a certain type of architecture. So what him and Gottfried Semper as well lift up the chalet, this image here, as kind of like
the architecture of the Aryan race. This is what our architecture is supposed to look like. And so this is, by the way, from Charles Davis, and you can learn about this in Canon Fodder, which is a great lecture that I recommend checking out. So this is the village of Golonfen which was a colonized area of Poland. So German architects would take this idea of their quote unquote indigenous architecture, which had been with them for a long time, this idea of the farmstead, which would be, so they would kind of take this to say, okay, this is our connection to the land. And that would be a way of colonizing an area. So they were actually colonizing Poland a little bit even before World War I. So the question is, how did the image of like that, architecture of the white race, and I hope you can see I'm putting so many quotation marks on this, because this is, again, something that was very much constructed for political, of course, for political gain. So how did that turn into this? This is the House of the White Man. This is by Johannes Itten from 1921. Johannes Itten was an artist. He's a theorist, a designer. He was from Switzerland, and he was a proponent of Mazdaznen, which was a new age and very appropriative kind of white supremacist ideology. And so he actually defined much of the curriculum at the Bauhaus School. So let's talk about the Bauhaus School. There were many people like Itten there, but he was one of the people, again, that really defined a lot of their early curriculum, and wrote many essays that spoke to the white race as representing the quote unquote highest level of civilization. So let's break down the Bauhaus a little bit. This, of course, was a design school in Germany from 1919 to 1931. This is credited with laying so many of the foundations of modernist design and architecture, and is very much associated with sleek, ornamentless, industrial design, but also is generally conceived of as having this really progressive or even leftist ideology. And so one thing I want to point out before kind of diving too far into it is also that there were many students at the Bauhaus that produced some absolutely incredible work, a very colorful work as well. So we have these textiles, the theater design. This is the ballet, which you should absolutely check out. It's absolutely fabulous. And these wooden toys. There were some amazing students there, or the Bauhäusler, who were communist students, there were Jewish students, there were queer students, all doing just really amazing inventive work. And you can read a lot about this also in the work by Elizabeth Otto. She's a fantastic Bauhaus historian. So there were also these three, but one thing that people often focus on a little bit, usually are the leaders of the Bauhaus, the three leaders: Walter Gropius, second is Johannes Meyer, and the third is Mies van der Rohe. And we're going to break them down a little bit in a moment. So again, this is often very associated with minimalist design and very sleek and ornamentless. And this was in order to put a focus on industrial machine-produced design. This was a huge, huge focus of the Bauhaus. The Vegas factory was designed by Walter Gropius a little bit beforehand. That people are always associated with the Bauhaus is their end, the demise. The Nazis came, this is generally told, the Nazis came in and shut down the Bauhaus. They saw it as un-German, as Bolshevists, as communists, and it is absolutely true. They did do it. They did come in and do that. They were reacting to the allowance for communist cells, for leftist students to set up organizations and practice there. But the question that I kind of want to raise is, how much was this a reaction to the modernist aesthetics, and how much was this a reaction to the people, to communists and Jews and people that were allowed to live there? Because if the Nazis hated Bauhaus so much, why did so much fascist architecture look so modern? And this is also this part is from this is from Italy. That building. So if we put out fascism, we all know what that is. We also this autocratic government is this focus on race, but it's also very specifically a movement that begins in the 20th century. And the reason I want to point that out is that we often think of fascism as this very conservative movement that looked backwards. However, there are many scholars like Roger Griffin who see this as a very distinctly modernist and forward-looking movement that embraces technology with a very certain verve. So Ludwig mies van der Rohe, eventually the Bauhaus gets shut down. And so he often described as fleeing to the US. But something that's really interesting is that the propaganda minister of the Nazis, Joseph Goebbels, actually finds industrial modernism something that could be very useful for their propaganda. And so he actually shortlists mies van der Rohe in order to design their Reichsbank and so other designs. So he actually Mies continually tries to court the Nazis. He tries to work with them. And so he sees it's going well until Albert Speer shows up, who becomes the actual Nazi architect. And we're going to get back to him in a moment as well. So we have these three leaders that are generally seen as incredibly progressive. And so we have Walter Gropius, who also submitted plans for the Nazi Reichsbank building in a competition. Hannes Meyer is actually kicked out for being too much of a communist, although he also has some kind of strange ideas about race. And then we have Ludwig mies van der Rohe, who he came in, he was viewed by the students as a fascist. He shut down their communist activities. He was shortlisted by Goebbels, and he submits plans for the Nazi Reichsbank building as well. And if they, wanted, so these are the plans that they submitted, by the way. So if they wanted to work with the Nazis so much, they actually ended up getting their wish in meeting Philip Johnson. Philip Johnson is an American architect that founds the architecture department at the Museum of Modern Art. And together with Henry Russell Hitchcock. So sorry, I'm going to see if I can mute that. So he founds the architecture department at the Museum of Modern Art and coins the term of the international style and brings people like Walter Gropius and mies van der Rohe to New York. And he was also a very, very hardcore Nazi. And the question a lot of people want to ask, sorry if you can see me kind of laughing a little bit, in our Jewish tradition, we usually, laugh to keep from crying kind of thing. So sometimes I kind of end up smiling with how ridiculous this stuff is, because how blatantly bad. So just how much of a Nazi was Philip Johnson? He 100% a Nazi, right? So let's take a look at just how much of a Nazi this person was that ran so much of the Museum of Modern Art. This is a timeline of all of the Nazi activities that he had. So he begins making visits to Europe and becomes friends with mies van der Rohe in the 1920s. Then he personally finances and founds the architecture department, curates the International Architecture Show, and then after that goes to Berlin, attends Hitler Youth rallies, attends the Nuremberg rallies. He goes back and forth between New York and Europe. He supports American Nazis and fascists such as Lawrence Dennis, Huey Long, and Father Charles Coughlin. He designs the platform. So there's this rally. This was a New York City Nazi rally in 1939, something that is often not discussed, how big the Nazi movement was in the US during World War II. And so he attends that one, but there's also another one from 1936 in Chicago, which has 80,000 people. He actually designs the platform for that and models it off of a Nazi design. He works for Social Justice, which was a Nazi publication, and publishes many, many anti-Semitic articles. And he follows the Nazi army around as it invades Poland. The FBI eventually finds piles and piles of Nazi literature, connections to 18 other people who were planning to overthrow the American government and install fascism here. But he's never arrested. They are arrested, he's never arrested. He covers up his tracks, and there's a possibility that he's actually protected by the Museum of Modern Art and Nelson Rockefeller. It is the worst kept secret in New York. Everybody knows this guy has a Nazi past, but he continues at MoMA until 1988. And later on, we find that this is not just a political thing. This is also, it is not one direction, this goes both ways. We see that Albert Speer says that if the Führer another Führer was going to rise up, who would you pick as the Nazi architect? And he said, well, I hope that I would pick that Philip Johnson would find, not only because of his political views, but also because of his aesthetics. And so if we look a little bit back at Albert Speer and his aesthetics, again, this is often described kind of a lot is given over to some kind of ornamentalness of this, but I actually see it instead as, this is often defined, especially the part on the right, as stripped classism. So there's actually a notable lack of ornament, save for a couple Nazi logos. But there's very sleek lines, lots of monumentality, lots of rationalism. This is an architecture that sought to exercise its power over the populace. But I actually find it really interesting to look at Italian fascist architecture, which embraced modernism a lot faster. So this is one, the Casa del Fascio by Giuseppi Terragni, where every single detail of this building was designed to uphold fascism. And we see this still being described as a masterpiece of modern architecture, something that a lot of people have looked to through the years since then. And I feel like it's pretty clear. I'm probably not gonna to point out too many of the similarities. I think you can see what the similarities are. This is Johnson's Glass House in New Canaan, Connecticut. Many years later, this extreme minimalist aspects, this rectilinear, very rationalist, very use of sleek lines, a lot of glass. And so you can see that he actually, I think, in my view, definitely drew from the aesthetics that he really loved in Nazi and fascist architecture. And interestingly, in 1939, he introduces the international style, which was defined by its simple geometry and lack of ornamentation. This really lays the foundation. This exhibition at MoMA, this was in 1932, really lays the principles for the foundation of a lot of modern architecture. And he lays out he brings four quote unquote leaders of modern architecture. And we've already met two of them. One is Walter Gropius, one is Louis van der Rohe, another is J.J.P. Oud, and the fourth is Le Corbusier. We've already talked about those two. J.J.P. Oud is eventually kicked out of modernism by committing the crime of using ornament. And Le Corbusier is also a fascist, it turns out. And so he's viewed as being wildly influential in architecture, probably some say would be the most influential architect of the 20th century, as well as city design. So he is really a huge proponent for using cars in city, and this is very, very influential as well. But he also has these extensive fascist activities that aren't really discussed until around 2015 with the publication of this book, Le Corbusier on Fascisme Français. So these are a couple of his fascist activities: endorsing various reactionary groups, attending rallies with violent reactionary fascist groups, working in Vichy France, supporting the Nazis, and specifically being anti-Semitic in his language as well. And so if we go back, and so if we go back a little bit in his career to closer to the beginning, he writes this book called Le Voyage d'Orient. So this is an Orientalist where he travels to the Balkans and to Cairo and declares that the color is suited to simple races, peasants, and savages. So you see this really similar conversation about color as we saw earlier with Adolf Loos and ornament. And he has the same opinions about ornament as well. But he kind of has this moment of quote unquote relief when he gets to the Parthenon, which is still seen as this very Western thing, even though modern Greek culture was not seen as Western, it's seen as very Eastern. And he's relieved that it's covered in, it's not colored, even though, many historians, many classical historians would purposefully overlook the evidence that there was this was actually painted originally in bright colors. So what is that tendency to not believe that or to want to reject that? And so there's a book by David Batchelor from 2000, which is called Chromophobia, which is this distinct, what he calls like a fear of color in Western European especially in academic and professional, very wealthy culture. So this is something that I made a couple of videos about this, is reflected in a lot of very, very, very a kind of exclusive, very sleek and minimalist, often very wealthy design, where you can see this a lot in a lot of interiors, kind of celebrity homes, which are very, very all white. And this is actually on one side of a spectrum, in contrast with this kind of over opulence that you've seen in other areas of this kind of like high kind of wealthy aesthetic. And this is actually Yves Saint Laurent's home in Marrakesh, which is a form of chromophilia, which is another thing that David Batchelor points out. And this takes the form of Orientalism. And we're not going to go too deep into this, other than just to say that Orientalism is this depiction of the other, often in the East, with exaggerated characteristics, and use of lots of color and ornament, in the way that Le Corbusier was describing the culture in the Balkans. And so often maligning those cultures. And so this is just to point out that one thing I never really want to say is anything like, you know, no ornament bad, ornament good. Like, it's this very complicated kind of interplay where ornament is this really powerful thing. And there's a lot of ways that people have appropriated it and used it kind of in bad faith in the past. But really quickly, so I'm watching the time, what are the consequences of this legacy of racism in architecture? And the erasure of ornament. So one is this lack of conversation surrounding ornament, because if it's the view of it being something that's supplemental and not very important, the conversation surrounding it is also viewed as not important. So we see very, very few contemporary books published about this topic. And so I actually, neither of these books in the last 10 years really discuss, or last 20 years, really engage. They both discuss Adolf Loos, because any conversation of ornament from modernism always talks about Adolf Loos, but neither really contends with his racism, and the reasons that other people picked up on his racism and embraced it so fully. So I actually wrote a at this image, is that there is not a, so we need an extensive ornamental research curricula in place in order to examine how surface design interacts with form and space. I believe this is something that is left out of the architecture discipline, and is something that I believe is actually damaging the way that we design in general. And here's a little bit about why. This also goes with preservation as well. When there is the erasure of culture, there's an erasure of culture and history that comes along with not paying attention to, especially these ancient symbols and modes of communication that, again, are not just have many practical purposes, such as memory boards. These are from 19th, 20th century, not even that ancient, but these are ancient traditions, which are fundamental in the Republic of the Congo, record history through ornament. Also have the destruction of our buildings. So older ornamental structures are often left to deteriorate. Here in Philadelphia, these are structures that are deteriorating at the expense of communities that once lived in them. And so I've put up a whole bunch. I'm going to kind of go through again, watching the time. There is a climate, and if we focus on building new structures and not restoring old structures, it's incredibly detrimental to our climate. It's incredibly detrimental to, for example, Black home ownership here in Philadelphia, where people are kicked out of their homes when they don't have the resources to repair them. And there's also damage to the historical record, especially when it comes to Black history in Philadelphia, where we see that Philly is losing its historic buildings at an alarming rate, and Black history, buildings that have to do with Black history more than anything. And there's, of course, there's also these environmental damages, not only to the building of new buildings, exactly, but also once they're built, the air conditioning that is taken to use them. So we see these very ancient and newly created, based on ancient wisdom, crafts of using passive techniques to cool a building. So we can see that from these very old wind towers, and again in Iran, to newer structures like the Eastgate Center in Harare, Zimbabwe. So we can see there are ways to actually ventilate a very large building by using passive biomimicry systems that are based on indigenous knowledge. But however, almost virtually the entire time, we are going deeper into a reliance on energy consuming air conditioning in quote unquote homes, like this article says, that are built like trapping heat in a plastic bag. So not only are these buildings reliant on air conditioning, they are specifically bad at ventilation. So there are also, but what are also these legacies of racism in the industry? Le Corbusier, was not only him, is not just him by himself there, but he's also welcomed by the rest of the industry. People were very comfortable with him being a Nazi, and Le Corbusier as well. And so we see that these galleries are still called the Philip Johnson Galleries in the Museum of Modern Art, despite many calls to take them down. And so we could see that in MoMA, there were no, it was until 2016 that there were 0 works acquired by a Black artist or a Black designer. And so the white supremacist legacy of Johnson absolutely lives on at Museum of Modern Art. We can see that still only 2% of licenses, of architectural licenses, are awarded to Black architects, 0.4 by Black women. And there are so few licensed indigenous architects that are awarded licenses that's often rounded down to 0%. And this extends to the environment and offices as well. And where recently Brian Barber was giving a talk, he's an indigenous architect, that he was met with outright bigotry through racist slurs. And so Mabel O. Wilson actually points out specifically in this article that Adolf Loos is taught in Ornament and Crime School. Ornament and Crime is taught in architecture school, often without any type of pushback. And she notes that in her 30 years as an academic, she can see just how much whiteness permeates everything that we do. And so you can see this in racism engraved in the infrastructure, from highways that demolish marginalized communities, to the way that this this exists with an exclusionary design of sundown towns as well, and all white communities in mid-century home design. And so we see this as well in the interior design industry. And there aren't, of course, as many, there aren't numbers to talk about this, but it's something that a lot of people are paying attention to and are talking about more and more. But I want to just end by saying that this is changing. I don't want to put a kind of a pall on the on all of this. So many people are on the case. So many incredible people that I've had the amazing blessing of working with and learning from, and people that we can read from and listen to. And these are just some of them. These are just all the people I could fit on this page. But again, from preservation to thought leadership to public art to architectural history and theory, I think that we're really at a turning point with books that are being published in the last 5 years, and just art from Project Pipeline to DAP Collective, really, really incredible stuff. So, so I just wanted to, those are just a couple of resources and people to look to. So again, just want to say thank you so much. I want to end there. Yeah, if you have any questions, let me know. That was a lot, so I'll take it.
I have, some people in the room here. Does anybody in the room want to ask a question? I have one.
Yeah.
When's your book coming out?
Oh my God. Not for not for a long time, but thank you. I really, really want to write a book on ornament eventually. So I think that'll be a longer project down the line. I think that is but I hopefully would like to focus on that. Because again, I really think there is just a lack of conversation surrounding the way that ornament affects our lives. One thing I didn't include in the conversation, but wanted to kind of to highlight was that there is still so much I think ingrained like prejudice against people with tattoos, especially with face tattoos, especially with indigenous face tattoos, that people still have a hard time getting jobs with those tattoos. And this goes all the way to graffiti, where graffiti is a kind of public ornament. And you'll see, of course, the price of an area, the price of a building will plummet when there's graffiti on that building, where it's associated again with crime. When graffiti isn't hurting anybody. And so that's another thing that I really hope one day I'll have the opportunity to write that. Would be awesome.
You also have several professors that are watching this. So if you could give advice to professors of design and architecture, what would you advise them?
So one thing that I would say was that a lot of the time what I end up seeing in articles about we were realizing that people like Corbusier or Philip Johnson had these really far right ideologies, white supremacist ideologies. One thing that I often see is this question: how do we contend with that? Like, how do we? And what I think that question or that is actually reflective of is this statement, where it's like, how do we keep celebrating these structures instead of really changing the way that we think about architecture? When we see that these like kind of quote unquote founding fathers are really ingrained their ideologies into this work. And so this is something that Charles Davis talks about a lot. And I really, again, I really love his talk called Cannon Fodder, which is on YouTube. And so this is what he talks about is really changing the idea of, what good design looks like, and why we uphold these very specific ideas of form as being the kind of highest level of design, and realizing how much, and kind of really starting to break down how much how Eurocentric or how literally white supremacist those ideas of form could be. And so I think it goes a lot farther than just saying, okay, how do we wrestle with this? And instead, I think a lot of us have to do that work of really upending how we think about the ways that buildings are built or the ways that we decorate our spaces. And so that is something that I like to throw out there. I think, so that's something that I see a lot, is that we have that idea we need to somehow contend with. And I think one of the things that a lot of people describe, especially when finding out, for example, someone like Le Corbusier was a fascist and not this progressive humanist, is this feeling of grief and loss. And that's something that I think is really fascinating. One thing on my channel I often get are these very a lot of people will get really mad and they'll get really angry. This will come out in anger a lot of the time, where they realize, when they are confronted with the idea that Mies van der Rohe did not flee the Nazis, he just left because he didn't have any work. And so this is something that, again, I think is not just something we need to contend to and try to wrestle into this idea of those designers being these really progressive and lovely people, but instead really try to decolonize the way that we actually think about design and architecture in general.
Okay, and what about advice to students?
So one, oh my gosh. So one thing that I'm just gonna make sure that my my computer doesn't bleep anymore. So I mean, one thing is that some of this can be very overwhelming. And I think the only reason that I don't get, too overwhelmed by once you realize how ingrained these things are, again, I think it can be a little bit, it can be a little bit sad sometimes to look and to see like how do we change this? But I think the best thing that I can, the best advice that I could give is that like really just these are, and again, I just kept this up on the screen just to show like a few of the people that are really working on these like absolutely incredible projects. So Melissa Daniels runs a podcast called Architecture is Political. She talks with tons and tons and tons of amazing preservationists, architects, designers, community builders. Brian Seeley Jr., who I had the pleasure of working with at Colloquate Design, runs something called Design with Protest Collective that's always releasing talks. And Nikita Reed is a preservationist who has a really cool podcast called Tangible Remnants, which talks about these very non-white centric versions of preservation, which is desperately needed. So there are all these people out there that are doing really amazing work. And so it's really cool to listen to them, especially and hear their kind of career trajectories. And see, where did they come from? Where did they realize that something was weird about the way that they were, the curriculum that they were brought up in, and how they made those kind of radical departures. Another one is that I also really like and I like, again, everybody here, POC Art is this really incredible Instagram account where you can see all of these designers that are pushing back on these norms and these principles. The other thing that I wanted to kind of throw out there is that that I focus on race a lot in my research, but this goes beyond race as well. And so there are people like, for example, Adam Nathaniel Bowman, who I'm forgetting what his last name is, but Adam Nathaniel, oh my gosh, I talk to him all the time, but he's an architect that also focuses on queer aesthetics and like the way that queerness has been kind of pushed out of the architecture industry. There's also a lot to talk about with misogyny and with the ways that women architects have an incredibly hard time in the industry. And so this is all very intersectional, and it all comes back to, again, it comes back to these norms that are set up by white supremacy. So again, this is what I end up focusing on, but it doesn't mean that there are also these other structures that are in place. There's a lot to think about, again, so it can be overwhelming, it can be a lot, but I think that it is, it's something that we need to contend with, and realize that it's a little bit sad to realize just how many of our buildings have been ingrained with this kind of supremacist ideology. There are so many incredible designs, kind of like the Harare, the structure that I showed earlier that has passive cooling, there's so much hope as well. There's so many incredible things and incredible people that are working on amazing projects. So yeah, I think that's something.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so we want to say thank you to you, Isabella. That was an amazing presentation. Thank you for giving up your time and energy to do this for us. And we hope that we'll have another event with you, or maintain some kind of a relationship with you between Kean Interior Design and yourself. So
I'd love to.
you can, anyone that has questions or anything, feel free to hit me up on Instagram or my email or anything. I'm happy to talk with anyone that is interested in researching this stuff. And I would absolutely, thank you so much for having me. It was really a huge honor.
Yeah, so everybody needs to follow her. Isabella is a prolific poster, I guess she
Both a lot.
Interstellar Isabellar. So yeah, follow her and keep that conversation going with yourself and with everybody that you know in design and architecture. All right.
All right. Thank you so much again.
So last thing, this has all been recorded, so I will clean it up and post it on our YouTube channel. And for anybody that misses this, that you think should see this, it will be available soon.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.